Thomas was 12 years old when he discovered that survival sometimes means running toward nothing, with no plan except escaping everything. It was a February night when the temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero in the rural hills of Pennsylvania. Thomas had been living at St. Catherine's Orphanage for 3 years, ever since his parents died in a car accident on Route 9 during a winter storm. The orphanage stood like a gray fortress on the edge of a forgotten town, housing 47 children in conditions that would make any compassionate adult weep. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell ran the institution with an iron fist wrapped in false piety. She was a tall woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. She quoted scripture during meals, but served portions so small that hunger was a constant companion. She preached about discipline, but delivered punishments that left bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. Thomas had learned to survive by becoming invisible. He was quiet during meals, efficient with his chores, and careful never to draw attention. He had watched other children who complained or resisted disappear into the basement for days, returning hollow-eyed and silent. The orphanage operated on the edge of legality, surviving through minimal state funding and donations from a church whose pastor never actually visited to see how the children lived. Social workers came twice a year for inspections, but Mrs. Blackwell always prepared for those visits with theatrical precision. Fresh food appeared temporarily. The heating worked for those 48 hours, and the children were coached on exactly what to say. Thomas had tried once to tell the truth during an inspection. He was 9 years old then, and he pulled the social worker aside to whisper about the cold dormitories, the insufficient food, the punishments in the basement. The social worker, a tired woman named Mrs. Patterson who carried too many cases and too little authority, had looked at him with something between pity and irritation. Young man, Mrs. Blackwell has run this facility for 15 years with an impeccable record. I understand that orphanage life is difficult, but making up dramatic stories won't improve your situation. You should be grateful for the roof over your head. That night, Mrs. Blackwell had called Thomas to her office. She didn't yell. She didn't hit him. She simply stared at him with cold blue eyes and said, "Lying is a sin, Thomas. A very serious sin. You'll spend the next week in the meditation room thinking about honesty." The meditation room was a windowless storage closet in the basement, barely large enough to sit down, with a single blanket and a bucket. Thomas spent 7 days in near total darkness, receiving 1 meal every 24 hours. When he emerged, he had learned that telling the truth to the wrong people was more dangerous than staying silent. But 3 years of silence had worn him down to nothing. The cold dormitory, where he slept with 9 other boys. The watered-down soup that was supposed to be dinner. The constant fear of saying the wrong thing, looking the wrong way, existing too loudly. And then came the night that changed everything. Thomas woke up at 2 in the morning, needing to use the bathroom. The orphanage had strict rules about nighttime movement, but the alternative was wetting his bed, which would result in public humiliation and extra chores. He moved quietly through the dark hallways, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. That was when he heard the screaming. It came from below, from the basement where children were sent for punishment. But this wasn't the usual sound of a child crying after hours of isolation. This was raw terror. Thomas froze at the top of the basement stairs, his heart hammering so loudly he feared it would give him away. Logic told him to return to his bed, to cover his ears, to pretend he heard nothing. But something deeper, some core of humanity that 3 years of institutional cruelty hadn't completely extinguished, pulled him forward. He descended the stairs slowly, keeping to the edges where the wood didn't creak. The basement was lit by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls. The screaming had stopped, replaced by muffled sobbing. Through the gap in a partially open door, Thomas saw something that would replay in his nightmares for years. Mrs. Blackwell stood with 2 men Thomas had never seen before. They wore ordinary clothes, jeans, and heavy jackets, but there was something about them that screamed danger. One was tall and broad-shouldered with a shaved head. The other was shorter, but carried himself with the contained violence of someone comfortable inflicting pain. On the floor were 3 children. Thomas recognized them immediately. Sarah, age 10, who had tried to run away 2 weeks earlier. Marcus, age 13, who had gotten caught with a smuggled letter he was trying to mail to a local newspaper about conditions at the orphanage. And little Emma, only 7 years old, who had the misfortune of being Sarah's roommate and therefore guilty by association. All 3 had visible bruises. Emma was crying silently, her small body shaking. Sarah stared at the floor with empty eyes. Marcus held his arm at an odd angle, possibly broken. They need to understand that there are consequences for disloyalty, Mrs. Blackwell was saying in a voice completely devoid of emotion. This institution operates because children know their place. When they forget, they must be reminded. The bald man nodded. What do you want us to do with them? Keep them here for the week. Minimal food. Minimal water. They'll learn. They always learn. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. He had known the orphanage was cruel, but this was something different. This was systematic brutality, carried out with the calm efficiency of people who had done this many times before. He must have made a sound, a gasp or a sharp intake of breath, because suddenly Mrs. Blackwell's head snapped toward the door. "Someone's there," she said sharply. Thomas ran. He heard heavy footsteps behind him as he sprinted up the basement stairs. His thin socks provided almost no traction on the wooden floors, and he nearly fell twice as he raced toward the dormitory. But he knew that returning to his bed was pointless. They had heard someone. They would check every room. They would find him. Instead, he veered toward the kitchen, toward the back door that was always locked, but whose lock was old and loose. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Blackwell's voice, cold and certain. "Find him. He saw too much. We'll deal with him separately." Terror gave Thomas strength he didn't know he possessed. He threw his full weight against the back door, and the old lock gave way with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent building. Cold air hit him like a physical blow. He was wearing only his thin pajamas, socks, and no coat. The temperature was 15 degrees below zero, and snow covered the ground in a thick blanket that immediately soaked through his socks. But behind him was certain punishment, possibly worse than punishment. Ahead was the unknown forest that stretched for miles behind the orphanage, dark and vast and freezing. Thomas ran into the darkness. The first minutes were pure adrenaline. He crashed through bushes and stumbled over hidden roots, his feet going numb almost immediately. Behind him, he heard shouts and saw flashlight beams cutting through the trees. The forest in winter was a different world, stripped of leaves and mercy. Every branch seemed designed to scratch exposed skin. Every shadow could hide a pursuer. Thomas had no sense of direction, no plan beyond putting distance between himself and the orphanage. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs turned to rubber. He ran until he couldn't hear the shouts anymore, until the flashlight beams disappeared. He ran until he collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for air that felt like knives in his chest. The reality of his situation crashed over him like the cold itself. He was 12 years old, alone in a frozen forest in the middle of the night, wearing pajamas, with no food, no shelter, and no idea where he was. The temperature was dropping further. His feet were already beyond pain, settling into a dangerous numbness. His hands were so cold he could barely move his fingers. He was going to die out here. The thought came with strange clarity. He would either freeze to death in the next few hours, or he would return to the orphanage and face whatever Mrs. Blackwell had planned for witnesses who saw too much. Thomas curled into a ball behind the fallen tree, trying to preserve whatever warmth remained in his body. He thought about his parents, killed 3 years ago on a winter road. He wondered if this was how their final moments had felt, cold and frightened and alone. He must have lost consciousness, because the next thing he knew, gray dawn light was filtering through the bare branches above him. He was shaking so violently his teeth chattered, and he couldn't feel his feet at all. But he was alive. The realization brought neither relief nor hope, only the stark understanding that he now faced another impossible choice. He could try to return to civilization, to seek help from authorities who hadn't believed him before. Or he could go deeper into the forest, hoping to find shelter before hypothermia claimed him. He chose the forest. For 2 days, Thomas existed in a fog of cold and hunger. He found a small stream where he could drink, though the water was so cold it hurt his teeth. He discovered that pine needles could be eaten in small quantities, though they did little to ease the constant ache in his stomach. He spent the first night curled beneath a thick pine tree, the branches providing minimal shelter from the wind. On the second night, he almost gave up. He had no energy left. His feet were covered in blisters and frostbite. Every movement required conscious effort. He laid down in the snow beneath another tree and closed his eyes, thinking that maybe this was simply how his story ended. 12 years old and forgotten, another statistic in a system that didn't care. But something made him open his eyes one more time. Some stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished. And that's when he saw it, barely visible through the trees as the last light of day faded. A shape that didn't belong in the natural landscape. Too geometric. Too deliberate. Using the last of his strength, Thomas crawled toward it. What he found made no sense. In a small clearing, almost completely buried under decades of accumulated earth, vegetation, and snow, was a railroad car. Not on tracks, those were long gone, but settled into the ground as if the earth itself had slowly swallowed it. Only the top portion of the car was visible, covered in vines and moss, with one side partially exposed where erosion had carved away the soil. It looked like something from another era, with faded paint and rust streaking its metal panels. But more impossibly, there was a door, and that door was accessible. Thomas crawled to the door, his frozen fingers struggling with the handle. It was old and stiff, but it moved. With his last bit of strength, he pulled it open. The interior was completely dark. Cold air flowed out, but it was somehow less cold than the open forest. Thomas crawled inside and pulled the door closed behind him, shutting out the wind. He couldn't see anything. For several minutes, he simply lay on the floor, breathing, trying to gather enough strength to explore wherever he was. Gradually, as his eyes adjusted, he realized there was faint light filtering through gaps in the buried structure above him. What he saw made him forget the cold, forget the hunger, forget everything. The railroad car's interior was frozen in time. Unlike the exterior, which had been ravaged by decades of weather and neglect, the inside had been remarkably protected by the earth that covered it. There were seats, old-fashioned bench seats with cracked leather, but they had been modified. Blankets had been carefully folded and stored in sealed wooden crates. There was a small wood-burning stove, still intact, with a stack of ancient but dry firewood beside it. Shelves had been built into the walls, holding mason jars with long-expired but sealed food, candles in protective glass, and books wrapped in waterproof cloth. But what made Thomas begin to cry, really cry for the first time since his parents' death, were the toys. In one corner, carefully arranged on a small shelf, were children's toys from another era. A wooden train set, a stuffed bear with button eyes, a collection of hand-carved animals, a jump rope, a baseball that had somehow retained its shape despite the years. Someone had lived here. A child had lived here. And whoever had prepared this space had done so with love. Thomas pulled himself to the wooden crates and opened them with shaking hands. Inside were thick wool blankets, slightly musty, but still intact. He wrapped himself in layer after layer, feeling the first hint of warmth he'd experienced in days. Beside the crates was a leather satchel, remarkably well preserved. Inside were papers, protected by oilcloth wrapping. Thomas's fingers were too cold to properly handle them, so he focused first on basic survival. He managed to light one of the candles using matches stored in a waterproof tin. The small flame seemed like a miracle. Then, with careful hands that were slowly regaining feeling, he built a small fire in the wood stove. The chimney, he discovered, was cleverly designed to vent through a hidden pipe that emerged far enough away that smoke would dissipate before being noticed. As warmth slowly filled the buried railroad car, Thomas examined his refuge more carefully. It was clear that this had been someone's emergency shelter, prepared with meticulous care. But who? And why here, in the middle of nowhere? He opened one of the sealed mason jars and found preserved peaches that, miraculously, still seemed edible. He ate slowly, his stomach cramping from days without food. Each bite tasted like hope. It was only after he'd eaten, warmed himself, and wrapped his damaged feet in cloth torn from an old sheet he'd found, that Thomas finally examined the papers in the leather satchel. They were written in careful handwriting, some in pen and some in pencil, on paper that had yellowed with age but remained readable. The first document was a journal entry dated July 15, 1935. "We've finished preparing the railroad car today. Jonathan helped me carry the last of the supplies from the wagon before I had to send it back to town. The conductor thinks we're crazy, preparing for something that might never come, but Sarah and I know better. The times are getting harder. Men are losing their jobs, families are losing their homes, and violence is spreading as desperation grows. If things get worse, if we need to disappear for a while, this will be our refuge. Far enough from town that no one will find us. Protected enough that we can survive a winter if necessary. I've built it for Sarah and for Jonathan, so they'll always have a safe place, no matter what happens in the world outside." Thomas's hands trembled as he turned to the next page. Another entry, dated September 3, 1935. "Sarah is pregnant. We're going to have a child. The railroad car, which I built as a precaution, now feels like a promise. A promise that our child will always have somewhere safe to go, somewhere they're protected and loved, even if Sarah and I can't always be there. I've added more supplies, more blankets, toys that I've been carving in the evenings, books for teaching reading and mathematics, everything a child might need to survive, but also to grow, to learn, to feel human even in the worst circumstances." The next entry was dated December 20, 1935. "Our son was born yesterday. We named him William. He has Sarah's eyes and my stubborn chin. Holding him, I understand now why I felt compelled to prepare the railroad car with such care. It wasn't just about survival. It was about creating a place where love could exist even when everything else failed." Thomas continued reading through the journal. The entries painted a picture of a young family during the Great Depression, facing economic collapse and social upheaval. The father, whose name was eventually revealed as Robert Mitchell, had been a railroad worker before the company collapsed. He'd claimed this abandoned railroad car as salvage and buried it in the forest as a secret refuge. The family had used the shelter several times during the worst years of the Depression, hiding from debt collectors, from men who came to repossess what little they owned, from the violence that sometimes erupted in desperate times. But the final entry, dated March 8, 1943, was different in tone. "William is 8 years old now. The Depression is over, replaced by a war that has taken so many young men. Sarah and I are no longer young. I've been diagnosed with a heart condition that the doctor says will claim me within the year. Sarah's health is also failing, though she tries to hide it from William. We've made arrangements for William to live with Sarah's sister in Ohio when we're gone. She's a good woman with a kind husband. He'll be loved. He'll be safe. But I've kept the railroad car secret, maintained and supplied, because I've learned that the world is unpredictable. Safety today doesn't guarantee safety tomorrow. I've updated the property deed to include specific provisions. If William never needs this refuge, it will remain hidden and forgotten. But if any child, any desperate soul, finds this place and needs shelter, I want them to know they're welcome. I want them to know that someone, somewhere, understood what it meant to be afraid and alone." There were legal documents as well. A deed showing that Robert Mitchell had legally claimed the land where the railroad car was buried, a small plot of forest that had been considered worthless. A will that had been updated as recently as 1970, when William Mitchell, now an adult, had apparently reconfirmed his father's wishes that the property and its contents be maintained as a refuge. But the document that made Thomas's breath catch was dated just 2 years ago, 2012. It was a codicil to William Mitchell's will, signed and notarized, stating that the railroad car refuge and the land it occupied, along with a trust fund that had been growing for decades, would become the legal property of any orphaned or abandoned child who discovered it and needed it as genuine shelter. The document specified that the child would need to present themselves to attorney David Harrison in the nearby town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, with evidence of their discovery and testimony of their circumstances. If verified as legitimate, the child would receive not just the property, but also sufficient funds to ensure their education and support until adulthood. Thomas read the document 3 times, not quite believing what it said. He checked the dates, the signatures, the official seals. Everything appeared authentic. He had stumbled into something impossible. A refuge prepared 3 generations ago, maintained across decades, and legally designated for exactly someone like him. A child with nowhere else to go. But the document also presented an impossible dilemma. To claim this inheritance, he would have to leave his hiding place, return to civilization, and trust adults again. Adults who had already failed him. Adults who worked with Mrs. Blackwell. Adults who didn't believe children when they told the truth about abuse. What if this attorney Harrison was connected to the orphanage? What if going to him meant being sent back to Mrs. Blackwell? What if this was all some elaborate trap? Thomas spent that night in the warmth of the railroad car, wrapped in blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme, surrounded by evidence that good people had once existed in the world. He fell asleep holding the stuffed bear with button eyes, the same bear that young William Mitchell had probably held 80 years ago when he was afraid. And for the first time since his parents' death, Thomas dreamed of something other than loss. He dreamed of possibility. The next morning, Thomas made a decision. He would stay in the railroad car until he was stronger, until his feet healed and his body recovered from the trauma of those frozen days in the forest. Then he would carefully observe the town of Millbrook, learning what he could about Attorney Harrison before revealing himself. He would be cautious. He would be smart. He would not blindly trust anyone. But he would also not give up on the possibility that the documents he'd found were genuine, that somewhere in this broken system there might be one honest adult who would help rather than hurt him. Over the following week, Thomas established a routine. He rationed the preserved food carefully, supplementing it with edible plants he found near the stream. He read every book in the railroad car's small library, from adventure stories to basic mathematics texts that William's parents had stored for his education. He kept the fire small and only during the coldest hours, making the ancient woodpile last as long as possible. His feet began to heal, though they would carry scars for the rest of his life. His body slowly recovered from hypothermia and starvation. But more importantly, his mind began to heal. In the solitude of the buried railroad car, away from constant fear and surveillance, Thomas started to remember who he was beneath the survival instincts that had defined his orphanage years. He remembered that he liked to draw, and found old pencils and paper that he used to sketch the forest outside. He remembered that he liked to read, and lost himself in adventure stories about children who overcame impossible odds. He remembered that he had once been a child who laughed, before the orphanage taught him that laughter drew unwanted attention. It was during the second week that he heard voices in the forest. Thomas froze, immediately extinguishing the candle he'd been reading by. Through tiny gaps in the buried railroad car's walls, he could see flashlight beams cutting through the trees. "The tracks are too old," a male voice was saying. "No way he survived this long in the cold." "Mrs. Blackwell wants us to keep looking," another voice replied. "She's worried he'll talk if he makes it back to town." Thomas held his breath as the searchers passed within 30 feet of his refuge. But the railroad car's camouflage was perfect. Decades of earth and vegetation had made it invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for a buried structure. After the voices faded, Thomas sat in the darkness for a long time, processing what he'd heard. Mrs. Blackwell was still searching for him. She was worried he would talk, which meant she had something to hide, something serious enough that she'd sent searchers into frozen forests to find one 12-year-old boy. That night, Thomas made his final decision. He wouldn't hide forever. He would take the documents to Attorney Harrison. But first, he would observe the town carefully. He would be smart about whom he approached and when. The next day, Thomas made his first trip to Millbrook. He waited until afternoon, wearing the warmest clothes he'd found in the railroad car, layers of old but serviceable garments that made him look like any rural kid from a poor family. He'd used melted snow to wash his face and had done his best to comb his hair with his fingers. Millbrook was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Thomas stayed on the outskirts, observing from a distance. He saw the main street with its handful of shops, a diner, a post office, and a small brick building with a sign reading Harrison and Associates, attorneys at law. He spent hours watching who came and went from the building. He saw ordinary people, farmers, and small business owners going in and out. He saw Attorney Harrison himself, a man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, helping an elderly woman down the front steps with patient kindness. Nothing about the scene suggested corruption or danger, but Thomas had learned that appearances could be deceiving. Mrs. Blackwell also appeared kind to outside observers. It was while watching from his hiding spot behind a hardware store that Thomas overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two women were standing near a truck, talking while loading groceries. "Did you hear about that reporter from Philadelphia?" one asked. "The one investigating the orphanages?" the other replied. "Mary something?" "Mary Catherine Rodriguez. She's been asking questions all over the county about that place, St. Catherine's. Apparently, there've been complaints for years that no one ever followed up on." Thomas's heart began to race. A reporter investigating St. Catherine's. Someone from outside the local system. Someone who might actually listen. "I heard she's staying at the Millbrook Inn," the first woman continued. "She interviewed the Hendersons yesterday about their nephew, who ran away from St. Catherine's last year. He told them awful things, but when they tried to report it, the local authorities said the boy was just acting out." Thomas waited until the women left, then carefully approached the Millbrook Inn, a small two-story building at the edge of town. He didn't enter. Instead, he found a spot where he could observe the entrance, waiting to see who came and went. Around 5 in the evening, he saw her. A woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, carrying a recorder and a camera bag. She looked focused, purposeful, like someone on a mission. Thomas watched her enter the diner across the street. He waited 30 minutes, gathering his courage, rehearsing what he would say. Then, with his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, he walked across the street and entered the diner. Mary Catherine Rodriguez sat in a corner booth, reviewing notes while eating a sandwich. Thomas approached slowly, every instinct screaming at him to run. When he reached her table, he stood silently until she looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked, not unkindly. Thomas's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You're investigating St. Catherine's orphanage. I have information. But first I need to know you're someone who actually listens to children when they tell the truth." Mary's expression changed immediately. She set down her sandwich and studied Thomas carefully, taking in his too thin frame, his nervous posture, his clothes that didn't quite fit right. "Sit down," she said gently. "I'm listening." Thomas sat. And for the first time since his parents died 3 years ago, he told an adult the complete truth about everything he'd experienced, everything he'd witnessed, and everything he'd found in the buried railroad car in the forest. Mary Catherine Rodriguez listened without interrupting. She took notes, but more importantly, she believed him. Thomas could see it in her eyes, the immediate recognition of truth, the professional understanding of someone who'd investigated enough cases to distinguish genuine testimony from fabrication. When Thomas finished his story, showing her the documents he'd carefully brought from the railroad car, Mary sat back and exhaled slowly. "Thomas, what you've described is a pattern of institutional abuse that I've been tracking across 3 counties. St. Catherine's is one of 7 facilities I'm investigating, all with similar complaints that local authorities never properly pursued. But what you witnessed, the physical violence, the systematic intimidation, those are criminal acts. Not just abuse. Assault. Conspiracy." She pulled out her phone and made a call. "David? It's Mary Rodriguez. I'm at the diner, and I need you to come here immediately. It's about the orphanage case." Yes, I know it's after hours. David, I have a witness. A child witness. It's urgent. 20 minutes later, attorney David Harrison entered the diner. He was exactly as Thomas had observed him earlier, an older man with kind eyes and an air of careful professionalism. Mary quickly explained the situation while Harrison listened, his expression growing increasingly serious. When she finished, he turned to Thomas. Son, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer honestly. Can you do that? Thomas nodded. Do you know who I am? You're attorney David Harrison. You have an office on Main Street. I watched you help an old lady down your front steps. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. You've been observing me. I needed to make sure you weren't connected to Mrs. Blackwell before I trusted anyone. That's remarkably intelligent caution for someone your age. Now, do you have the documents from the railroad car with you? Thomas pulled them from inside his jacket. Harrison examined them carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like wonder. My God, he murmured. I helped William Mitchell update this codicil 2 years ago. He told me about his father's railroad car refuge, but I honestly never thought anyone would actually find it. William died 8 months ago. He never married, never had children of his own, but he was determined to honor his father's vision of helping a child in desperate circumstances. Harrison looked at Thomas directly. These documents are legal and binding. If you found the railroad car under the circumstances you've described, if you genuinely needed shelter and claimed it in good faith, then you're entitled to the property and the associated trust fund. But claiming it means entering the legal system, and that means potential exposure to people who wish you harm. Are you prepared for that? I can't hide forever, Thomas said quietly. And if what I saw at the orphanage is happening to other children, then someone needs to stop it. Mary and Harrison exchanged glances. Mary spoke first. Thomas, I've been building a case against St. Catherine's and similar facilities for 6 months. What I've lacked is insider testimony, someone who lived through the abuse and can speak to systematic patterns rather than isolated incidents. Your testimony could be the key to shutting down multiple abusive institutions. But it will require you to testify formally, possibly in court. It will mean confronting Mrs. Blackwell and the people who work with her. It will mean reliving trauma publicly. That's not fair to ask of a 12-year-old child, but I'm asking anyway because hundreds of other children's futures depend on stopping this system. Thomas thought about Sarah, Marcus, and Emma, beaten in the basement for trying to tell the truth. He thought about all the children still at St. Catherine's, living in constant fear. He thought about William Mitchell, who had maintained refuge for 8 decades in the hope that one desperate child might find safety. I'll testify, he said, but I need protection. Real protection. Not just promises. Harrison nodded. Understood. Here's what we'll do. Effective immediately. I'm activating the Mitchell Trust and establishing you as its beneficiary. That gives you legal standing as a property owner and trust recipient, which provides certain protections. Mary, you have contacts at the state level, correct? I've been working with the state attorney general's office on the broader investigation. They can provide protective custody while we build the formal case. Good. Then here's the plan. Tonight, Thomas stays with my family. My wife and I have raised 3 children and fostered 7 more over the years. Our home is secure. Tomorrow, we contact the state attorney general and begin formal proceedings. Mary, you coordinate with your contacts to ensure Thomas's testimony is properly documented and protected. Within 72 hours, I want a formal investigation opened into St. Catherine's. Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope combined with support, the sense that adults were actually organizing to help rather than harm him. That night, Thomas slept in a real bed for the first time in weeks, in the Harrison family's warm home. Mrs. Harrison, a gentle woman with silver-streaked hair, had prepared dinner and treated him with kindness that expected nothing in return. Their adult children had moved out, but the house still carried the atmosphere of a place where children were genuinely loved. Lying in clean sheets, with a full stomach and no fear of midnight violence, Thomas cried. not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being safe, of finally being believed, of finally being treated like a child who mattered. The next 72 hours moved with startling speed. Attorney Harrison and Mary Rodriguez coordinated with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to launch a formal investigation. Thomas provided detailed testimony, recorded and documented by professional investigators who specialized in child welfare cases. His testimony about the basement incident provided probable cause for an immediate inspection of St. Catherine's orphanage. When investigators arrived unannounced, they found exactly what Thomas had described. Children with unexplained injuries, inadequate heating and food, and locked rooms in the basement that served as punishment cells. Mrs. Blackwell was arrested on charges of child abuse, neglect, and assault. The two men Thomas had seen in the basement were identified as convicted criminals she'd hired as unauthorized security. Further investigation revealed financial fraud, as Mrs. Blackwell had been systematically stealing state funds meant for children's care and using them for personal expenses. But the investigation expanded beyond just St. Catherine's. Mary Rodriguez's reporting had uncovered a network of similarly operated facilities across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, all sharing certain characteristics: minimal oversight, isolated locations, and directors with connections to a loose network that exchanged information on how to avoid regulatory scrutiny. Thomas's testimony became the catalyst for what newspapers would later call the Pennsylvania orphanage scandal, leading to the closure of 11 abusive facilities and the reform of oversight systems statewide. Through all of this, Thomas lived with the Harrison family. Attorney Harrison formally became his legal guardian while adoption proceedings moved forward. The process would take time, but the outcome was already certain. The Harrisons wanted Thomas as their son, and Thomas, for the first time since his parents' death, wanted to be someone's son again. The Mitchell Trust provided substantial funds for his future. Harrison explained that William Mitchell had been a successful businessman who'd invested wisely, and the trust had grown considerably over decades. Thomas would have guaranteed support through college and beyond, as well as ownership of the forest property where the railroad car remained hidden. But Thomas asked Harrison to do something specific with a portion of those funds. He wanted to establish a foundation dedicated to helping other children in crisis, providing legal representation, emergency shelter, and advocacy for those trapped in abusive institutional situations. Willie Mitchell's father built that railroad car to save one child, Thomas explained. William maintained it for 80 years, hoping to save one more child. I want to use what they gave me to save as many children as possible. That's how I honor what they did for me. Harrison smiled. William would have liked you very much. 6 months after crawling into that buried railroad car, Thomas stood in a courtroom watching Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell receive a sentence of 15 years in prison for multiple counts of child abuse and fraud. The children who'd been at St. Catherine's had all been transferred to properly regulated facilities or placed in foster care. Sarah, Marcus, and Emma, the 3 children Thomas had seen beaten in the basement, were all safe and beginning to heal. Mary Rodriguez won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on the orphanage scandal. She used her increased platform to continue advocating for child welfare reform. And Thomas, now legally Thomas Harrison, began 8th grade at Millbrook Middle School. He was a quiet student, thoughtful and serious, but his teachers noticed something in him that set him apart. A maturity born from surviving things no child should survive, combined with a determination to ensure other children didn't face those same horrors. One evening, Thomas asked Mr. Harrison to drive him back to the forest, to the buried railroad car. They parked at the edge of the woods and walked the now familiar path to the hidden refuge. Thomas showed his adopted father the interior, now empty of the supplies he'd used, but still intact and protected. I want to keep maintaining it, Thomas said. Not for me, I don't need it anymore. But for the next child who might. The world hasn't stopped being dangerous for vulnerable kids. Someone else might need this place someday. Harrison put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Then we'll maintain it together. Every month, we'll come out here and restock supplies, check the structure, make sure it's ready. We'll honor Robert Mitchell's vision by keeping his refuge alive for the next child who needs it. They stood together in the clearing, looking at the buried railroad car that had saved Thomas's life. The evening sun filtered through the bare branches, casting long shadows across the snow. "Do you ever regret running that night?" Harrison asked quietly. "Even though it led to safety, those days in the forest nearly killed you." Thomas considered the question carefully. "I don't regret it. Running was the only choice I had. Staying meant accepting abuse, maybe dying in that basement. Running meant maybe dying in the forest, but at least dying free. When those are your only options, you choose freedom every time." And finding this place taught me something I'd forgotten since my parents died. It taught me that good people exist. That someone, somewhere, cares about children they'll never meet. That love can be built into places and things, preserved across generations, waiting for the exact moment when someone desperately needs to find it. Harrison nodded slowly. "You're going to do important work in your life, Thomas. You already have." As they walked back to the car, Thomas looked over his shoulder one more time at the buried railroad car, barely visible beneath its camouflage of earth and vegetation. It looked like nothing, like an abandoned piece of forgotten history. But Thomas knew the truth. It was a monument to compassion, a physical embodiment of the belief that children deserve protection, that preparation for disaster is an act of love, and that sometimes the most important places are the ones hidden from casual view, waiting to be discovered by those who need them most. The railroad car had saved his life. But more than that, it had restored his faith that the world, despite all its cruelty and indifference, still contained pockets of deliberate, preserved, intergenerational kindness. And Thomas would spend the rest of his life working to create more of those pockets, more refuges, more proof that someone, somewhere, cares about children who have nowhere else to go. Because he understood now what William Mitchell had understood, that saving one child creates ripples that extend far beyond that single life. That child might grow up to save others, to build systems of protection, to become the kind of adult who believes children when they tell the truth about their suffering. Thomas Harrison walked out of the forest, that evening holding his father's hand, leaving behind the buried railroad car, but carrying with him the lesson it represented. That survival is only the beginning. That healing is possible. That one person's preparation can become another person's salvation. And that the best way to honor being saved is to dedicate yourself to saving others. The railroad car would wait in its forest clearing, maintained and supplied, ready for the next child who needed it. And Thomas would spend his life making sure that fewer children needed such desperate refuges, that more children found safety in systems designed to protect rather than harm them. Because that's what children who survive the impossible often do. They grow up determined to make the impossible unnecessary for the next generation. And sometimes, if they're very lucky, they find adults who believe in them and help them transform their trauma into purpose. Thomas had found those adults, and he would become one of them. The story of a 12-year-old boy who crawled into a buried railroad car to escape freezing death had become a story of a young man who would dedicate his life to child advocacy. The railroad car had been the shelter that saved him, but the Harrisons, Mary Rodriguez, and the memory of William Mitchell had been the forces that healed him. And healing, Thomas had learned, is how you transform survival into life.